In a forgotten corner of the city, a quiet chef with a mysterious past begins cooking at a struggling diner. His dishes aren't just meals, they're secrets. Each bite holds a story, and with every plate, the diner begins to heal. But as the whispers about the chef's true identity grow louder, Karen, the diner's owner, must uncover what he's hiding before it's too late. Will the silent chef's past destroy their future, or can food be the key to salvation? The city was a labyrinth of neon lights and bustling streets, but down an alley far from the noise there was a small diner that no one seemed to notice. Karen had inherited Maggie's Diner, a place once loved by locals but now fading into obscurity. Bills piled up, customers grew scarce, and Karen's exhaustion mirrored the diner's decline. The smell of stale coffee mixed with the musty air, creating an atmosphere of neglect that no amount of cleaning could shake. It was late one evening when Riley, the silent chef, appeared at the diner's door. Tall and lean, with dark hair that fell messily around his face, he wore a faded apron and carried nothing but a canvas bag. His eyes were hidden beneath a brimmed hat, his face gaunt as if he hadn't seen the sun in years. "I'm looking for work," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Karen eyed him with caution. She was skeptical. Most people who walked in were just looking for a quick meal or a handout, but something about Riley felt different. There was an odd stillness to him, as though he didn't quite belong to the world around him. "Are you a chef?" Karen asked, her tone polite but weary. Riley nodded, his gaze intense but soft. "I cook," he answered simply. "All right," Karen said, giving in to desperation. "I'm short-staffed, but I can't promise much. You can start tonight. But we're not busy, so don't expect a rush." Riley gave a small nod, the barest hint of gratitude in his eyes. He walked to the kitchen without another word, leaving Karen standing at the counter, unsure of what had just happened. In the kitchen, Riley moved with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime in this space. His hands were steady, slicing vegetables and arranging the ingredients with an almost unnatural grace. As the flames of the stove flickered and the smells of garlic and onions filled the air, Karen couldn't help but be drawn to the aroma. It was the first time in months the diner had felt alive. Minutes later, Riley placed a plate of food on the counter, seared chicken with roasted vegetables, a perfect balance of flavors. It was simple, but it was beautiful. Karen took a bite, surprised by how delicious it was. The flavors danced on her tongue, familiar yet new, as if they carried memories of something long forgotten. "Who taught you to cook like this?" Karen asked, finally breaking the silence that had hung in the air. Riley paused, his back to her as he continued his work. "No one," he replied softly. "I learned on my own." Karen wanted to ask more, but something in his voice warned her against pressing. Instead, she simply nodded, watching as Riley effortlessly transformed the diner's meager ingredients into a symphony of flavors. As the night wore on, Karen noticed something strange. Riley never spoke unless absolutely necessary. He didn't engage in small talk or offer pleasantries. He simply cooked, moving through the kitchen like a ghost, his hands speaking more than his words ever could. But as the last customer finished their meal and the diner emptied for the night, Karen found herself wondering, who was this silent chef and what was it that he was hiding beneath that quiet exterior? The night was still young, but the diner had already begun to change. The question now was, would Karen uncover the truth before it was too late? The next few days felt like a strange blur. Riley continued to work in the kitchen, his presence both calming and unsettling. The diner, once a place of quiet despair, had transformed under his silent hand. The food was impeccable, and despite the steady stream of regulars, Karen noticed that there was a growing sense of mystery surrounding her new chef. The town's residents, skeptical at first, began to return. Word had gotten out about the quality of the meals, and before long, Maggie's Diner wasn't just a local secret, it became the place to visit, a hidden gem in a city that had long since forgotten it. But Karen's unease only grew. Riley never spoke, except when absolutely necessary. He never told her where he'd come from or how he'd learned to cook so well. He never shared anything about himself beyond the essentials. His silent, stoic nature seemed to pull people toward him, but at the same time, it kept them at arm's length. One evening, as the dinner rush started to wind down, Karen stood at the counter, absently wiping down the surface. The doorbell chimed, signaling the arrival of a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, with sharp features and eyes that immediately gave off an air of authority. His tailored suit contrasted sharply with the diner's worn decor. He approached the counter with a purposeful stride, his gaze flicking to Karen. "Is the chef here?" he asked, his voice smooth but urgent. Karen frowned, unsure of what this was about. "He's in the kitchen, but—" The man cut her off, his eyes narrowing. "I need to speak to him now." Karen hesitated but nodded. She turned and called into the kitchen. "Riley, you've got a visitor." Riley's eyes flickered over to the door, his usual calm demeanor wavering just slightly. Without a word, he set down his knife and made his way toward the counter. The stranger's eyes seemed to follow him closely, a mix of curiosity and something darker in his gaze. Riley stopped just short of the counter, his face unreadable, but there was something about his posture that suggested he was bracing for something. The stranger stepped forward, his eyes now locking with Riley's. "You've been running from me long enough," the stranger said, his voice low, almost threatening. "But I'm not going to let you hide anymore." Karen stood, frozen, her heart racing. She had never seen Riley react like this. His expression shifted imperceptibly, his usual composure replaced by something that looked almost fearful. It was the first crack in his carefully maintained silence. "I told you I'm not coming back," Riley said, his voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "You don't get to make that decision. You owe me and you owe the others. It's time to settle your debt." Karen's stomach dropped. What was Riley involved in, and why was this stranger so insistent? Before she could say anything, the man turned sharply and walked out of the diner, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Riley stood motionless for a long moment, his eyes dark, his jaw clenched. Karen took a tentative step forward. "Riley, who was that?" Riley's eyes met hers, and for the first time he seemed to hesitate. The walls he had so carefully constructed began to crumble just slightly. "It's not something I can explain, not yet," he said, his voice strained. "But you need to understand something. I'm not just a chef. I didn't come here to run a diner. I came to hide." Karen's heart skipped a beat. Hide from what? He didn't answer, his eyes flickering to the door as if the man might return at any moment. His expression hardened, again the moment of vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "Just forget this conversation," Riley said, his tone flat and final. "For your own good, don't ask questions." But Karen wasn't ready to let it go. She had witnessed something that didn't add up, and now her curiosity was piqued. As Riley turned back to the kitchen, Karen's mind raced. Who was Riley hiding from, and why had he chosen her diner to disappear into? It was clear now that Riley wasn't just a chef. He was running from something, someone, and the truth of what had brought him to Maggie's diner was a story much darker than anyone could have imagined. Later that night, as Karen lay awake in her small apartment above the diner, she heard the sounds of heavy footsteps in the alley below. The muffled sound of a car engine starting followed. It was a sound she'd heard countless times before, but tonight it felt different. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Riley wasn't the only one hiding. And soon, Karen realized, she would be dragged into a world she never knew existed. A world that was darker and more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The next morning, Karen opened the diner as usual, but the atmosphere felt different. It was as if a dark cloud had settled over Maggie's. The diner, once a haven of quiet simplicity, now seemed to carry the weight of secrets. Both old and new. Riley was already in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with the precision of a master, but his movements were tense. Karen could sense his unease the moment she stepped into the kitchen. He hadn't spoken to her since their conversation the night before, and she wasn't sure if he even intended to. But one thing was clear. Something had changed. "Riley," Karen said, breaking the silence. "What was that about last night?" He paused, his knife hovering mid-air as his eyes flicked to her. For a brief moment, Karen thought he might speak, but instead, he dropped his gaze to the counter and continued chopping. "I told you to forget about it," he muttered, his voice cold. Karen's frustration grew. She wasn't going to let this go. "I can't. I'm worried about you, Riley. You're not the person you're pretending to be, and I need to know what's going on." Riley didn't answer right away. Instead, he let out a long sigh, wiped his hands on his apron, and turned to face her. His expression was somber, the mask of calm he usually wore slipping away. "There are things I can't explain," he said quietly. "Things you wouldn't understand." Karen stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "Try me." Riley hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if he were searching for an escape. After a long moment, he spoke in a voice so low it was almost a whisper. "I didn't just come here to run a diner," he repeated. "I came here because I'm trying to escape my past. And it's not just one person I'm hiding from. There are people looking for me. Dangerous people, people who don't care who gets in their way." Karen's heart raced, but she tried to remain calm. "What do you mean? What kind of people?" Riley clenched his jaw as though the words were physically painful to say. "They're a group I was involved with years ago. I didn't know what I was getting into, but by the time I figured it out, it was too late. I tried to leave, but they don't let you go that easily. They'll come for me eventually, and when they do, they'll come for anyone who's close to me." Karen's mind raced as she processed his words. Riley was in danger, and now, it seemed, she was too. Before she could respond, the bell over the door jingled, signaling the arrival of a customer. Karen quickly glanced over her shoulder, relieved for the interruption, but when she turned back to Riley, she noticed something unsettling. His usual composure had faltered. He was staring at the door, his body rigid with tension. Karen's eyes narrowed. The man from last night, the one in the suit. He was standing just inside the diner, his gaze fixed on Riley. The stranger's eyes flicked briefly to Karen before locking onto Riley. "I told you, it's time to come with me," the man said, his voice sharp, authoritative. Riley's face was like stone. "I'm not going anywhere with you," he said, his voice steady but with an underlying hint of defiance. The man stepped forward, his hand reaching into his coat pocket. "You don't have a choice." Karen felt a chill run down her spine. She had no idea what was happening, but it was clear that this wasn't just some misunderstanding. The situation was spiraling out of control. Without warning, Riley moved. His hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply, disarming him in one swift motion. The man stumbled back, eyes wide with shock. "Leave. Now," Riley commanded, his voice low but full of authority. The man's face twisted with fury. "This isn't over, Riley. You can't run forever." He turned and stormed out of the diner, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Karen stood frozen, her mind struggling to make sense of what she had just witnessed. Riley had moved with a speed and precision that she hadn't thought him capable of. The quiet, reserved chef had just shown a side of himself that was completely at odds with the person she thought she knew. What was that? Karen finally managed to ask, her voice shaky. Riley exhaled sharply, his body visibly tense. "That man is part of the group I told you about. The ones who want to control me, control everything I do. They won't stop until they've got me back, and they'll do whatever it takes to make that happen." Karen's pulse quickened. "What do you mean, control you? Why you?" Riley turned his back to her, his hands gripping the edge of the counter tightly. "I wasn't always a chef. I used to work for them. They promised me power, money, all the things I wanted, until I realized what they were really doing, what they were really about. When I tried to leave, they made sure I understood that there was no way out." Karen was reeling. The Riley she thought she knew, quiet, skilled, and mysterious, was nothing like the man standing before her now. He was running from something much darker than she could have imagined. "Riley, what happened?" Karen asked softly. He shook his head, not looking at her. I can't tell you everything. Not yet. But if you're asking why I'm hiding here, why I'm here with you, it's because I need time. Time to figure out what to do next. I don't want anyone else to get hurt. Karen felt a weight settle in her chest. She knew there was no turning back now. The quiet life she had known at Maggie's diner was over. Her world had just collided with Riley's dangerous past, and there was no way to escape it. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let him face this alone. Later that evening, as the diner began to empty out, Karen glanced toward the kitchen, where Riley was preparing the evening's meals with his usual focus. But something had shifted between them, an unspoken understanding that had formed, and as Karen locked the door and turned off the lights, she couldn't shake the feeling that the dangerous world Riley had been hiding from had finally found its way to her doorstep. The days after the incident with the man in the suit were tense. Every knock on the diner door made Karen's heart race. Every car that slowed in front of Maggie's felt like a threat. Riley's presence in the kitchen was quieter, more withdrawn, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But Karen refused to let him face it alone. She spent every moment she could with him, even if it was just in silence. They worked side by side, with her taking orders, clearing tables, and serving customers while Riley prepared the food with a meticulous focus that seemed to block out everything else. He didn't talk much, but the lines of tension in his shoulders and the flicker of unease in his eyes said everything. Then, one evening, as the diner was closing and the last of the customers trickled out into the night, Karen noticed a familiar, black SUV parked across the street. It had been there for nearly an hour, its headlights dimmed, but Karen knew exactly who it was for. Her stomach churned with dread. She glanced toward the kitchen where Riley was wiping down the counter. His back was turned to her, but Karen could see the subtle shift in his posture. He had noticed the car too. "Riley?" Karen said, her voice low, but she could feel the tension in the air between them. "What are we going to do?" Riley didn't respond at first. He stared out the window, watching the SUV with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I don't know," he said quietly, finally turning to face her. "But we don't have much time. They're getting closer. I can feel it." Karen's chest tightened. Who are they?" Riley's eyes flicked to the door as though the shadows might be listening. He lowered his voice even further, almost as if confessing a sin. "They're part of a criminal organization. It's not just about me anymore, it's about everything I know. They'll stop at nothing to get what they want, and if I don't go with them, they'll start hurting the people around me. People like you." The weight of his words hung heavily in the room, suffocating the air. Karen shook her head, trying to push back the overwhelming fear that threatened to consume her. "No, you can't go back to them, Riley. You have to fight this." He let out a bitter laugh. "You don't get it, do you? I can't just walk away. You think I haven't tried? They've made it clear that if I don't cooperate, they'll make sure I regret it. I've seen what they're capable of, and now they're not just after me." Karen stared at him, the realization sinking in. "They want me too." Riley nodded, his face grim. "They'll use you against me if they have to." Karen's heart hammered in her chest, but the stubborn part of her wouldn't let the fear take over. "No, I'm not going to let them do that. You've already helped me more than anyone else ever has, Riley. Now it's my turn to help you." Riley's eyes softened for a brief moment, but the sadness in them was unmistakable. "You don't know what you're saying. You're putting yourself in danger by even being here." Karen stepped closer to him, her voice firm. "I'm not afraid. We'll figure this out. Together." Riley looked at her, his expression torn. But before he could speak, the sound of a car door slamming shut echoed through the diner. The man in the suit. He was here. Riley tensed. "Get back inside," he hissed. "Lock the door, don't let him in." Karen's eyes widened, but she nodded. She quickly turned and rushed to the back of the diner, locking the door as quietly as she could. Her pulse was racing, her mind spinning with thoughts of what could happen next. She pressed her ear against the door, straining to hear any sounds. From the front. The front bell jingled, signaling the man's entrance. Karen held her breath as she listened to the sound of footsteps approaching. I know you're in here, Riley. The man's voice rang out, cold and steady. You can't hide forever. Karen's heart nearly stopped. She knew Riley was in the kitchen, but she had no idea what he was planning. She wanted to help him to fight back, but she had no idea how to. All she could do was wait and listen. Then there was silence. Karen's thoughts raced. Had Riley confronted him? Was the man gone? The door to the back opened suddenly and Riley stood there, his expression unreadable. The man in the suit was nowhere to be seen. They've made their move, Riley said, his voice low but full of resolve. We can't wait any longer. Karen stepped out from behind the door, her mind spinning. What do you mean? What's happening? They've been watching us, Riley said, his voice tightening. This isn't just about me anymore. They know about you, about the diner. They're going to try and force me back into their control, and if they can't get to me, they'll use you as leverage. Karen felt the cold sting of panic creeping up her spine. She had a million questions, but only one thing seemed certain. This was no longer something Riley could handle alone. What do we do? She asked, her voice trembling despite herself. Riley looked at her, his face pale, but there was a fire in his eyes she hadn't seen before. We leave. Now. But what? About the diner? What about everything we've worked for? Riley's eyes softened, but his determination was unshaken. We don't have a choice. They've already shown us how far they're willing to go. They won't stop until they have me back. And the only way to protect you and this place is to leave. Karen's chest tightened as she realized the magnitude of what he was asking. But deep down, she knew there was no other choice. She could run with him, fight back, or be caught up in a game she had never asked to play. The diner, the only home she'd known, was no longer safe. And neither was she. With a heavy heart, she nodded. Let's go. Riley grabbed his jacket and motioned for Karen to follow. As they moved toward the door, Karen glanced back one last time at the diner, the place that had given her everything, and now the place that she had to leave behind. The danger was no longer lurking in the shadows. It had come to claim them both, and they had no choice but to face it head-on. Riley and Karen stepped out of the back door, their eyes scanning the parking lot. The black SUV was still parked across the street, its headlights now off. But they both knew the danger was still there. It was only a matter of time before they were surrounded. Riley turned to Karen, his voice steady but urgent. We can't go down without a fight. If they come for us, we have to be ready. Karen nodded, her fear transforming into a fierce determination. She wasn't going to run anymore. She had too much to lose now, too much to fight for. Where do we go? Karen asked, her heart racing but her resolve firm. Riley pointed toward the alley next to the diner. We head for the back entrance to the storage room. It's a way out that they won't expect. From there, we make our way to the old warehouse at the end of the street. I know a few people who can help us there. As they moved quickly toward the alley, Karen felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. There was no turning back now. Every step was a step further into the unknown, a step away from the life she had once known. But she refused to let fear paralyze her. They reached the storage room door and slipped inside, closing it behind them with a soft click. The sound of muffled voices from the front echoed through the walls. Riley's pursuers were getting closer. Riley took a deep breath. We need to move fast. They won't waste time looking for us in here, but they'll check the back alley. Just as they began to move toward the back exit, Karen heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the door. The man in the suit was close, too close. Go, Riley hissed, grabbing Karen's hand. Now! They bolted for the side door of the storage room, slipping into the shadows of the alley. Karen's pulse thundered in her ears, and the sound of her breath was too loud in the silence that surrounded them, but Riley kept pulling her forward, his grip unwavering. As they neared the end of the alley, the first car screeched to a stop behind them. Karen turned her head, her heart skipping a beat. She saw the suited men getting out, their eyes scanning the surroundings with ruthless precision. Riley didn't hesitate. Run! They sprinted down the alley, weaving through the narrow path and into the back streets. Riley was right. This wasn't just about escaping, it was about surviving. They couldn't afford to be caught. Riley led the way, maneuvering through the darkened streets with familiarity, while Karen kept her eyes forward, focused on putting distance between them and the men hunting them. When they reached the warehouse, Riley led her to a hidden entrance, an old metal door on the side that creaked ominously when he pushed it open. Inside, the scent of dust and old wood filled the air. It was dark, but Riley quickly found a light switch and flicked it on. The warehouse was empty, save for crates and old machinery. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. "Stay here," Riley said, his voice gruff. "I'm going to make sure we're not followed." Karen watched him disappear into the shadows, her nerves on edge. She knew he was right. This was their last stand. They couldn't afford any more mistakes. A few minutes later, Riley returned, his face tense but relieved. "We're safe for now, but we can't stay here long. They'll search the area, and when they don't find us, they'll start looking for someone to blame." Karen stepped toward him, her mind racing. "What do we do next?" Riley exhaled slowly. "We need to disappear. I know a place upstate, a safe house. It's off the radar, and it's the only place we'll have a chance to lay low and figure out our next move." "But what about the diner?" Karen asked. "What about everything we've worked for?" Riley gave her a soft smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "I'm sorry, Karen, but the diner's gone. They won't stop until they find us, and they won't care who gets hurt along the way." Karen swallowed hard, the reality of it sinking in. She had built everything around that diner, around the life she had made for herself. But in this moment, survival was all that mattered. They were no longer fighting for their past. They were fighting for their future. With a final glance at the warehouse, Karen nodded. "Let's go." Riley grabbed her hand, and together, they walked out into the night, knowing that every step they took brought them closer to the unknown. But they weren't alone anymore. They had each other, and together they would face whatever came next.